Hello, class. Welcome back to our concluding session with Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Today, we are reading the Social Contract, a pamphlet that he wrote in 1762, 7 years after the second discourse on the origins of inequality. And this is really an account of his normative political philosophy. He's trying to articulate what he thinks ought to be the grounds for, as he calls it, legitimate government. Mind you, this is a text that is written more than somewhat two decades before the French Revolution, and Rousseau was really appropriated as by the revolutionaries as one of the major ideologists and thinkers behind the spirit of the French Revolution. Whether or not that is true, I'll leave up to you. But I should point that Rousseau's normative political philosophy has been interpreted in many ways. People think of him either as a radical Democrat, someone who believes in pure democracy. Some consider him to be a forerunner of modern Republican thought, and some view him as totalitarian. I think that my interpretation of him is that he's more of a Republican thinker in the spirit of Machiavelli, but he's also part of the social contract tradition. Right, so he has to again argue according to the structure of argument that has been laid out and invented by Thomas Hobbes, which, as you know, is a very strict procedure beginning with human nature and then trying to derive from it logically the necessity of government and the grounds for the legitimacy of government. Hobbes, again, just to repeat something that now you've hopefully is drilled into your brains, is trying to make the argument for absolute sovereign power, right? Sovereign power that comes out of a state of nature which is characterized by a war of all against all. And in order to escape that state of nature, people following natural reason arrive at an understanding that in order to establish peace, they have to relinquish all their rights. They have to relinquish all their rights, transfer it to a common power, sovereign power, whom they are obliged to obey. Okay. Locke, again, following the same tradition of argumentation, says that the only reason why you would even establish a common power over you if that common power better protects your natural rights, predominantly your property. Again, it is based on a certain kind of construction of community, political community, based on human rationality. Rousseau, as we saw again in the second discourse, has a very different account of the state of nature. And a state of nature, account of the state of nature, which you might think is very romantic, but in some sense it is much more logically consistent, right? And he views human beings in the state of nature as solitary beings who are devoid of language, philosophy, reason, rationality, or any kind of complex desire that would push them to think about life in an alternative social order, right? So they're content without being in society. Nonetheless, as he says in the second discourse, there is an irreversible transition once man enters into society, right? Once you have civil society, then you have government, and principally when you have government that becomes absolute, sovereign, beyond contestation and scrutiny and questioning, then it becomes really challenging to think about what might be the grounds of legitimacy or legitimate government, and what might be the possibilities for genuine freedom. Recall again that Rousseau is part of the Enlightenment tradition, obviously, but he also has a very critical attitude towards the Enlightenment. He has a skepticism of reason, and he views that all these things that entail for many other thinkers as the progress of human civilization in the epoch of Enlightenment, 17th, 18th century, are really indicative of profound moral failures, right? And in that sense, he has a faith in the original nature of humankind. This is what we might call is the romantic attitude in Rousseau. So for Rousseau, natural freedom is in line with human beings being spontaneous and instinctual, right? Again, think about the early Homo sapiens who are not encumbered by the pressures of social life, okay? So they're pre-social, they're pre-rational, they do not compete with each other, they're not aggressive, they're not violent, they have this kind of natural innocence and gentleness, and then they live in a world of abundance, right? Where there is absolutely no reason to engage in any kind of competition. So untouched by the burdens of philosophical speculations and social problems that gives, in his account, rise to things like envy, jealousy, resentment, hubris, and actually creates all these kinds of deformities that lead people to be treacherous, be deceptive, compete with each other. All of these happens only in the context of society, right? So you might think, after encountering the account in the second discourse, that Rousseau claims simply that we have to return to this original state of nature. But Rousseau claims that we cannot do that, right? It is an irreversible transformation. So the challenge is, how do we think about freedom, the possibility for freedom, that is to, in some sense, preserve this original quality in human beings, the original natural freedom that we are born with as spontaneous, instinctual, authentic beings, right? I recall again the distinction between to be and appear to be. And he says that appear to be has become the modality through which human beings mostly live their lives in society, and to be free would be simply to be, right, without any concern of how you appear to others. Appearing to others is the way in which the bourgeois lives. That's what he says. The bourgeois is always concerned with how they appear to others. So they're always already never living for themselves. They're alienated from themselves. Okay. So in this context, Rousseau, in writing The Social Contract, will try to give you a litmus test for the conditions under which genuine freedom is possible. Okay. Genuine freedom, which is in some sense recovery of that freedom in the natural condition. But since society is not something you can reverse, since human beings living in community and living in society is an irreversible step, this freedom must always be rooted and grounded in community. Okay. So his whole challenge in writing The Social Contract is to give you an account for how freedom might be reconciled with community and society. So let me then try to recall briefly the argument in The Origins of Inequality. Again, it's a very conjectural sketch of history. In fact, something that he doesn't really take seriously anymore on Social Contract. And it's not relevant so much. How the historical progress happened is not relevant. Recall that passage again where he says there are two facts, right? Man in the original condition and man as he is in the 18th century. And in that transformation, what you see is human beings from that original pure state of natural innocence gradually degrade themselves as they enter society, enter the world of private property, the creation of states, which ultimately culminates in absolutism of some kind, absolute sovereign power, that all human beings return to a kind of state of war of all against all, which is a Hobbesian state of nature, where all of human beings are equal. They're all equal only insofar as they are all subjects. They're all subjects. They're not free, right? So the book begins, On Social Contract begins with that very famous first line. He says, man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Right? It's a paradoxical argument. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. This says something about, again, his maybe romantic attitude. Rousseau wrote a book about childhood education, a book called Emile. And again, there what you encounter is a fascination with the newborn, right? The infant, who is in some sense still retains the original quality of original human quality, right? They're not corrupted by nature. He says, this is from a line in Emile, he says, everything is good as it leaves the hand of the author of things. That is, again, it's a kind of obviously theological argument. He views human beings as creations of God, but everything is good when we enter the world, right? When we're born free, right? We have the original natural human quality, and everything degenerates in the hands of man. Right? So society is what corrupts us. We are subjected to laws that we don't create. We become parts of communities, not of our choosing. We live our lives according to modalities that we did not pick, right? We become part of countries or political communities that engage in war with each other, kill each other, and we're willing to enter into conflict with others. In our own communities, we compete with each other for jobs, for education, and the rest, right? So this is a desperate world of animality, cruelty, competition, deception, conceit, and all the other maladies that afflict human life in modern society. So against this, he's going to make the claim that we need to have freedom. So the next sentence of this first book of the social contract, so he begins, man is born free and everywhere he's in chains. One thinks himself the master of others and still remains a greater slave than they. Okay, so even the sovereign power, even a monarch at this stage, but you can think about this even in the present context. Let's say the president of the United States, you might think that that person is the master, right? But really, it means that they're constantly appearing to be somebody for others, right? They're always on a stage. They always are playing specific roles. They're devoid of any kind of authentic sense of being. Okay, so even those who think of themselves as masters are not really free. They too are in some ways enslaved by society. How did this change come about? I do not know. Okay, so now here's a distance and skepticism of the account he gave in the second discourse. He doesn't know, but because in a way it is not relevant. And this is the crucial part. What can make it legitimate? What can make it legitimate? That question, I think I can answer. So the emphasis is on trying to make sure that a social order is legitimate. Okay, and the question is, under what grounds does the social order we inhabit, that we live in, becomes legitimate? And this is what will lead him to argue for a radical sense of political community, which is characterized by what I called positive liberty last time. Following Isaiah Berlin, the distinction between negative and positive freedom, the concept that I used was autonomy, right? Autonomous, giving a rule to yourself, right? So an ideal political community for Rousseau is one where there is robust political participation, and everybody in that community has an awareness and participation in making the rules according to which they live, right? So freedom is the key point, the key thrust of his whole political project. He wants to ground the conditions under which there can be freedom. And this is what he calls is the true social contract, okay? So the question is, why would a free person, again, think back to his conception of natural freedom. This is very different from Hobbes and very different from Locke. Okay, why would a person with that natural quality consent to be governed? Okay, and the question is, and the solution that he's going to provide is that you have to meet the conditions under which it becomes possible to obey freely. To obey freely. Think about that formulation. It's a paradoxical formulation. So the social contract is something that is legitimate only as long as you're able to obey the very rules that you create yourself, right? So you determine the rules according to which you live. Right? So government cannot be, the book begins with a critique of Hobbes. Government cannot be the will of the sovereign, right? It cannot be the will of the strong, because for Hobbes, who rules is purely a function of who has the greater strength, right? So he says, this is on page 5, the chapter on slavery. So he says that why would anyone accept complete obedience to a sovereign power? To do that is to become a slave. That is to give yourself completely to somebody else, right? To suspend your own will. And this is what Hobbes is saying, that everybody sacrifices their natural liberty. Right? Everybody gives up their liberty in order to be subject to the sovereign. So he says, to say that a man gives himself gratuitously is to say what is absurd and inconceivable. Such an act is null and illegitimate from the mere fact that he who does it is out of his mind. Okay, so anybody who is willing to give up all their rights in order to be governed by an absolute sovereign power is out of their mind. To say the same of a whole people is to suppose a people of madmen, that madness creates no right. Okay, even if each man could alienate himself, again, alienate is the notion, that is, you give yourself away, right? You detach your freedom, natural freedom, away from you, and you transfer it onto somebody else. Even if each man could alienate himself, he could not alienate his children. They are born men and free. Their liberty belongs to them. and no one but they has the right to dispose of it. Before they come to years of discretion, the father can, in their name, lay down conditions for their preservation and well-being, but he cannot give them irrevocably and without conditions. Such a gift is contrary to the ends of nature and exceeds the gift of paternity. It would therefore be necessary, in order to legitimize an arbitrary government, that in every generation, the people should be in a position to accept or reject it. But where this is so, government would no longer be arbitrary. Okay, so he's accepting that, firstly, even if there is a community of these mad people who are willing to alienate their natural quality and natural freedom and be subjected to common sovereign power, let's say in a fit of madness they do that, the generations that are born after cannot be that, right? They're still nonetheless born human and born free. They have this natural freedom, innate freedom in them. And therefore, any government that claims to rule over generations, subsequent generations, without the consent of those successive generations cannot be legitimate. It must be arbitrary. And if it is governed by the consent of those generations, then it cannot be arbitrary. So it's a contradiction in terms to have absolute government and at the same time claim that that absolute government is by the consent of the people. So he says this rule of the strong is what Hobbes' argument depends on. And this rule of the strong is not a sound political principle, because it simply means that whoever is stronger can disobey, right? Whoever can depose the king can disobey the king. Okay, so it does not meet the criteria for a legitimate government. The Hobbesian account of a society where everyone is willingly alienating their rights and becoming subject to an absolute sovereign power is, he says, is a contradiction in terms. There is no consent involved in this. This is simply the rule by force, right? Whoever is stronger acquires power and governs the subjects. It's a condition of slavery. You cannot talk about rights and liberties in this context. So the conclusion of that chapter on slavery, he says, the right of slavery is null and void, not only as being illegitimate, but also because it is absurd and meaningless. The words slave and right contradict each other and are mutually exclusive. So one simply cannot be slave and then claim to have rights. Right? So no acceptance of slavery. That would be to strip anybody who willingly enters into an arrangement where there's an absolute sovereign power to whom they're obliged to obey completely, that those people are stripping themselves of their very human quality. Okay. So the Hobbesian solution is simply not one that can hold. It cannot be a legitimate social contract. The Lockean solution also doesn't hold. It also doesn't hold because Locke's solution is to say, well, you only accept social order, you only obey, you only accept authority over you, authority of the state over you, as long as you make a rational calculation about your own private interest, right? So if you're better off, that is, your property is protected, then you're going to accept rule as legitimate, okay? And Rousseau contests this because he says that this involves no loyalty to the political community itself, okay? So if there is a rule of a government which is extremely violent towards a section of people, and you stand yourself away and ask yourself, is this government legitimate? And the procedure you go through in your head is simply a kind of utilitarian calculation, am I better off or not? Then you're already not taking into account the political community you're part of in making that decision. Okay, so this cannot be the Lockean procedure also cannot be the way in which you arrive at a legitimate and true social contract. Okay, more than that, there's also an argument about the majority itself. Okay? Let's say 70% of the people in a political community accept that something that the government does is valid. While the 30% nonetheless cannot be subject to that same contract. Okay, because majority as a convention of making decisions, it can work, but in order to even have that convention in place, you first need unanimity, right? So everybody in that community has to first accept that majority is the way in which we're going to make decisions and will ourselves into existence. Okay, so on both those grounds, he cannot accept a Lockean solution either. So what then is Rousseau's account of a social contract? Firstly, Rousseau will make the claim that is already implicit in Locke. He will make it much more explicit. And this is, in some sense, an argument for popular sovereignty. So this is, I'm reading from the penultimate passage of chapter 3 of book 1. He says, the gift is itself a civil act and implies public deliberation. It would be better, before examining the act by which people give itself to a king. So he's talking about why might people give and transfer authority and rights to a king. He says, it would be better, before examining the act by which people give itself to a king, to examine that by which it has become a people. Again, so becoming a people, that is becoming a political community, self-aware, and understanding that it is the source of all legitimate political authority. For this act, being necessarily prior to the other, is the true foundation of society, right? So the becoming a people, becoming a political community itself, is prior to the act of actually instituting government and sovereign power over you, right? So it's locating the primacy of the political community, the foundation of society. Okay. Now, what are the conditions under which there would be government? This brings us to the very famous chapter on social compact. And I would try to read out some passages at length here because they're extremely, again, profound. So he begins the chapter. I suppose men to have reached the point at which the obstacles in the way of their preservation in the state of nature show their power of resistance to be greater than the resources at the disposal of each individual for his maintenance in that state. The primitive condition can then subsist no longer. The human race would perish unless it changed its manners of existence, right? So there is no possibility of returning to the original state and preserving that original human freedom, the natural freedom that human beings are born with. But as men cannot engender new forces, but only unite and direct existing ones, they have no other means of preserving themselves than the formation by aggregation of sum of forces great enough to overcome that resistance. These they have to bring into play by means of a single motive power to cause an act in concert. Right? So there has to be some kind of consensus in the foundation of society. Right? If you're becoming a part of society, then it is something that is happening through agreement and consensus. This sum of forces can arise only when several persons come together. Okay, so from the vast bulk of multitude, solitary human beings in the state of nature, everyone comes together. But as the force of liberty, as the force and liberty of each man are the chief instruments of his self-preservation, how can he pledge them without harming his own interests and neglecting the care he owes to himself? This difficulty in its bearing on my present subject may be stated in the following terms. Okay, so he's saying, okay, in the social contract tradition itself, we've encountered Hobbes and Locke, and both of them are saying that in order for this kind of community to come into being, there has to involve a transferring of rights, right? Individuals have to give away their rights and their freedom in order for there to be obedience to a social order. So he's going to formulate the problem in very precise terms. And this is the key sentence. Libraries have been written on this sentence. He says, the problem is to find a form of association. The problem is to find a form of association, so a form of community, which will defend and protect with the whole common force of the persons and goods of each associate. So everything there has a certain kind of commonality, that everybody's capacities, freedoms, desires, and rationalities and possessions are brought together. They're conjoined in community. And are defended by the community, and in which, while uniting himself with all, he may still obey himself alone and remains as free as before. Okay, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone and remain free as before. So this is the key issue. This is the fundamental problem of which social contract provides the solution. So what are the grounds under which a human being can become part of a community, unite himself with a greater sense of society, but at the same time remain as free as they were, as humans, right? As individuals. So this is now the crisp formulation of the social contract. Each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. The general will. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. Okay, so this is the nature of a true social contract. It is the only condition of legitimate social contract, only true social contract. Okay, so legitimate social order only follows if this condition has been met, where freedom and community are reconciled with each other. Right. So this is the only grounds under which there can be simultaneously individual freedom with obedience to general universal laws, and at the same time, individual freedom along with the freedom of community, a solidarity that links together the individual's sense of their own concerns, their own private interests with a common good. Okay, and this is what the notion of the general will does, volonté générale. So only when government is expressed by the general will is it legitimate. And this requires that we, as members of community, are fundamentally in solidarity with each other. Okay, so let me say a few words about this notion of the general will, because it's a tricky notion. The general will is not consensus in any simple sense. Okay, it is not, firstly, majority rule, because again, the problem arises that how do you get the minority on board? The minority always will reserve the right to protest and exit the community. But it's not consensus in a simple sense, because in a way it requires coercion. It requires coercion. He says in the very next chapter, in order that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking, which alone can give force to the rest, and whosoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than he will be forced to be free. He will be forced to be free. Again, so freedom requires a certain degree of coercion. So it's not, again, consensus based on agreement, nor is it a summation or aggregation of private interests, or what Rousseau calls private wills. That would be a Lockean solution, right? Again, you just plug in the utilitarian algorithm, greatest good for the greatest number. But that is not community. Okay, you have individuals going through their own in their own head, well, whether or not this arrangement is good for me privately is not going to be the general will, because nobody there is concerned with the common good itself. Nobody's really thinking about community. Right? There's only a concern about their private interests. So it cannot be simply an addition or aggregation of these private interests. So the general will is something that has to be discovered. It is something that has to be discovered, and this is a process. Okay, it requires, in some sense, deliberation, but deliberation that is not aimed at compromise. Right? It's not that people, again, through a kind of majority principle, arrive at the medium position between two different positions on an argument. It's not as simple as that. The process of deliberation itself is a process of the transformation of human nature. Right? It is the process through which private interests become part of the common interest, and the common interests are already always incorporated in thinking about the self. Okay, so this requires the development, so the transformation of the human nature. So for Rousseau, the social contract is something that actually transforms us into citizens, from private individuals into citizens, where we develop a sense of civic virtue. Okay, and citizenship is something that has to be cultivated. It's not something that is given to you by law. It's not given to you at birth. It is a spirit and a capacity, a political capacity that has to be cultivated. And it is cultivated only in the sense in which you're able to become part of the general will. That is, your own private interest gets reconciled with the interest of the community. Now, this might strike you as somewhat exceptional, but if you think about it, it is something that perhaps you have experienced in small settings, right? If you have purposive groups, for example, social movements, right, where you're tackling a problem and you're trying to organize around addressing that problem, then maybe you have experienced this kind of experience of solidarity where the ambition of the group becomes also your personal ambition. This might even be true, believe it or not, in business organizations, in companies, where again, they're problem solving. They're trying to find a particular solution to, let's say, a problem in marketing or a problem in production, and all the teams come together, they work in a problem, and for a brief moment, they all become part of this organization, and they are able to sublimate their private interests into the interest of the organization itself. The examples that Rousseau likes to cite are actually examples from war. So just think about the cohesiveness of a military unit, right? Where everyone is acting as a member of a team, and the interest of the individual is completely dependent on the interest of the team itself, and vice versa. So if the individual wants to survive, the team, they require the team, and if the team is to survive, they also require each individual to do their job, right? And this is not simply something that applies to small units, military units. One could even, if you have encountered journalistic accounts of the things that are happening in Ukraine, for example, as they are resisting a military force the size of Russia, the whole nation itself is engaged in this kind of process, right? Everybody is contributing in some way to this resistance, to this military resistance against Russia. What does it mean? It means that no matter how old you are going to set up camps in your neighborhood to maybe treat people. You're going to engage in delivery of food. You're going to take care of each other, your neighbors. You're going to set up some kind of assistance to the troops that are fighting. So the whole, it is something that is, when a community is confronted with a common problem, then everybody becomes cooperatively a part of that whole community and have a sense of their obligation and duty to that community, and realize that their individuality and their personhood depends on the existence, the survival of the community and the achievement of the community's goals, right? So one is doing something freely, but they experience this profound and true solidarity where they're able to get rid of their narrow self-interest. Okay? So that's what it means to cultivate a citizenship, and that's what it means to develop the general will. The general will is, again, not an aggregation of individual private interests. It is precisely the process through which the common interest gets articulated and internalized by each of the members. Right? So the private will and the general will become reconciled and become one. So this raises the question, and this, by the way, he calls a kind of moral liberty in the chapter on civil state. We might, over and above all this, add to what man acquires in the civil state, moral liberty, which alone makes him truly master of himself, right? Moral liberty. So this becoming a part of a community, and at the same, and which then makes it available to have a sense of what the general purpose and will of that community is, and then in that spirit, enact the laws and rules by which that community exists and does and goes about. That's the only sense in which you obey freely, that you become a free master of yourself. So you cannot be individually a master of yourself. You're always already incorporated into the interests of the community, the interests and the needs of the community. So this raises the question, well, what kind of government then are we talking about? What is the form of the government we're talking about? If you go back and think about the classical forms, democracy, aristocracy, democracy that is the rule of all, aristocracy the rule by few, and monarchy the rule by one, or republic, which is a mixed regime, then what would Rousseau be arguing for? And one might think that he's actually sympathetic to democracy, but in fact, Rousseau is not really saying that. Rousseau would, in a way, say that democracy is too hard to do because not everyone can all the time be engaged in political life. Okay, so as an ideal, it is hard to achieve. It might be achieved under certain conditions. If the community is too small, then it might be, it's possible that it will be achieved. But then it would raise problems of dependency on other countries. It will make it vulnerable to invasions and the rest. So he actually settles on a kind of republic, but a kind of republic that where people are not only electing people in positions of in magistracies and legislative offices, it's also a political community where everybody gets to ratify the laws. This is crucial. So something like what modern day Switzerland is, right? Every citizen has to vote on each law, and a group of citizens can even raise concerns about the passage of a law, and in that case, the law would be subject to, again, further scrutiny. So it is not to our interest so much as what really the form of the government is. What we are really interested with Rousseau are the conditions under which we can say that we have arrived at the true social contract. Okay, so achieving the general will requires this process through which we can articulate again what the common interests and concerns are, and how we might be able to arrive at those. Right? And it requires people to transform their sense of their whole identity. That to become a citizen is to relinquish your own narrow private interests and already always think about yourself in relationship to the community. So you're no longer then thinking about, well, whether or not I'm going to consume things, whether or not I'm going to have a good life or satisfactory life. Your conception of what a good life is already embedded in having solidarity and being richer. So the experience is something I'm sure you've encountered in some settings, maybe in family life, for example. Sometimes when your families go through difficult times, you often stop thinking about your own careers, your own interests, your own desires to go out and have a nice time, etc. Right? You in some sense make yourself part of that small community and experience a kind of solidarity. So Rousseau's challenge is to try and see whether or not that is applicable in a broader context of a political community as a whole. So achieving this, he accepts, would perhaps, there are certain conditions under which this would be more achievable. For example, again, if the political community is small and independent, that is, it is politically independent, not subject to invasions from abroad, but also economically self-reliant. So a picture could be of a kind of decentralized confederation where you have smaller communities that, again, govern themselves, maybe village republics, something of that sort. And it also requires a certain kind of homogeneity, right? So you cannot have factions, you cannot have corporate groups, no distinctions between religious conflict. For example, you cannot have, a large group of Protestants or a large group of Catholics, unless religion has become so secularized that there is a certain kind of religious tolerance. Certainly, you cannot have the distinctions between the rich and the poor. Okay, that's always a recipe for conflict. There cannot be any kind of general will if you have these kinds of distinctions. So it requires a certain degree of social homogeneity. But nonetheless, if you take the account he's given us of the social contract, what it does is it raises a very hard to achieve and demanding test for legitimacy. Right? So it seems almost exceptional, the conditions under which there is an alignment, there's a complete alignment and correspondence between private and common interests. Right? So this experience of freedom is exceptional. And the point is, however, Rousseau's challenges the point of life, that in some sense, what it must be to be human, in some sense, is to pursue and chase this freedom, this sense of being where one can be authentic, right? One can be fully authentic and instinctual and spontaneous being, and not a bourgeois. A bourgeois is somebody who's always living for the opinion of others. Okay, and that is only possible under the true social contract. However, he accepts also there's always a pessimism in Rousseau, that even if you have this exceptional moment where you arrive at a true social contract, it is likely that that social arrangement will ultimately degrade and devolve back into this Hobbesian state of competition, malice, deception, and the rest. Right. So it's an eternal challenge that man always in society would aspire for authentic freedom through a social contract, but arriving at the true social contract, that is the constitution and generation of a general will, a will which is this kind of amalgamation of all private interests sublimated into the common interest, that might lead to an exceptional moment where a new society, there's a new foundation of society, new establishment of government, but that again can devolve back into the kind of depraved state that he takes issue with in the Origins of Inequality. So I'll stop here. The video yesterday was long enough, but I think if you read the early chapters of the social contract, it'll become apparent to you the account he's giving of what a true social contract is very different from Hobbes and Locke, and in a way much more stringent and difficult to achieve. But at the same time, it's a crystallization of a much more robust account of political freedom, which involves political participation and the suspension of one's private, individual, narrow self-interest into a view of the whole, and this emphasis on recognizing your belongingness to a larger community, and how that larger community is indispensable for your own life and existence. So I'll end with Rousseau there, and tomorrow or next week we do Marx.